Hello and welcome to the Society with Fatma Shaheen at PTV World. They say that every child has the right to be free from exploitation of child labor and to be protected from hazardous work that interferes with their education, which may not be the case for millions of children, unfortunately, in Pakistan or world over. But why particularly is this so in the context of a Pakistani society? This is something upon which we'll be shedding light today. Overall, we'll not only be talking about the causes, but we'll also be shedding light upon the consequences of child labor, more particularly child domestic labor, on the Pakistani society at large. In this regard, we'll also be shedding light upon not one, rather quite a few laws which do exist so as to, offer not one, rather quite a different kind of protections to child domestic laborers. In this regard, we'll also be talking about the extent to which we actually see such laws being practically implemented. In this regard, we'll also be talking about this from a health perspective, so to speak, because a lot of times we actually see that, children, when they, in the course of doing child labor, are actually subjected to exploitation, to abuse, how this in turn not only impacts them psychologically, but also physically and emotionally too. How particularly do such adverse childhood traumas actually then transcend to the rest of their lives? That is also a very important angle on which we'll be shedding light today. Moreover, in this regard, we'll also be talking about the need for there to be perhaps greater collaborative stakeholder engagement in this regard, so as to do away with this social menace at the end of the day. What can be the role of parents in this regard? What can be the role of educational institutions? And what responsibility then lies on the Pakistani media at large, so as to not only amplify the plight of child laborers or child domestic laborers, so to speak, but also by that virtue to do it in a manner which is then not only sensitive but ethical too. All of this today, that too with an extremely relevant panel. Let me introduce you to my today's panel. My first panelist for today's show is Ms. Laila Azhar. She is an expert on women, gender and labor rights. Assalamu alaikum, madam, and welcome to the show. Thank you, madam, for joining us. Alongside her, I have Dr. Naeem Zafar. He's a pediatrician, he's a child rights expert, and he's also the president of Pakistan Pediatrician Association Punjab. Assalamu alaikum ji. Welcome to the show. Thank you, sir, for joining us. My third panelist for today's show is Ali Raza. He's a legal and policy expert. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And via telephone line, we'll be joined by Ms. Elia Zehra. She's a journalist and she's also a writer. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show. Now, before we start the discussion on today's topic, let's have a look at this brief report.
Child domestic labor remains a serious social issue in Pakistan, but awareness around this menace is growing. Many recognize that it deprives children of their right to education and a safe childhood. Let's hear what Miss Aliza has to say about this.
Child domestic labor is a social evil, and this is because children are the foundation of the workforce in Pakistan, and not just the workforce, but the future of the country. Child domestic labor is making children work in houses, in companies, in homes, and this is a social evil because it takes away the fundamental rights of a child while they're growing. It is important for us to understand that this is a child's age for them to learn, grow, and have all the possibilities they possibly can for a stable future.
There are legal protections in place to combat this issue. Laws exist that strictly punish those who force children into domestic labor. Let's listen about fines and penalties.
When we talk about child domestic labor, this is a specific form of work in which the child's basically tasks have like such as cleaning, laundry and child care. Further, when we talk about it is very important to mention here, this is a very heinous type of work. When we talk about the other laws of Pakistan which are in the field, that is the Children's Employment Act 1991 also protects the children's, safeguard their rights, and further in their development has also been done in this act.
What Miss Aliza has to say about this.
It is important, however, for us as Pakistani citizens to ensure that we play our role in curtailing and eradicating child domestic labor by not participating in it, by discouraging it whenever possible, and making sure that children have access to education.
The government has taken several steps to curb child labor, including increasing school enrollment drives and enforcing labor laws more rigorously. However, the responsibility doesn't end here. Society too plays a crucial role in preventing this exploitation. By raising awareness, reporting cases, and supporting education, we can all contribute to ending child domestic labor for good.
Welcome back from the report. Now to get the conversation started with you, madam, at a very basic level, when we do talk about this growing social menace of child labor or child domestic labor, so to speak, globally, if we were to then analyze, we do understand factors like extreme poverty, issues like overpopulation, or for that matter, even recurrent crises, they actually contribute to growing cases of child labor. But when it comes to Pakistan and to our peculiar society, what kind of a cultural acceptance, what kind of a socio-cultural norms actually fuel this problem?
So, thank you so much, Fatma, for
You're
having
most
me in
welcome.
this very important discussion. And to add on to what you have already mentioned about the status of child domestic labor in Pakistan, I think Pakistan is not different from other developing countries. So, as the population is increasing, as the inflation is increasing, and what we have seen over the years, I was involved in basically getting the data with regard to the domestic workers in Pakistan 2008 onwards, and that was fed into the International Convention of 189, where the ILO was coming up with a new convention for the domestic worker,
Right.
for the protection of domestic workers. So I have seen very gruesome realities on the ground, where with regard to the domestic workers, coming, whether they are male or female or child workers, they are facing discriminations, violation, coming from extreme poverty, coming from whether they are living in urban areas, whether they are living in the rural backgrounds.
Areas. And also, madam, there is a very important gender aspect to this as well. Then.
Absolutely.
That is something that we cannot ignore.
So, the trend that we have seen over the years, and I have mentioned it many times in several interviews and several of the articles, that there is a trend that we have seen emerging in Pakistan also, that in the urban culture, that the trend of hiring domestic help has been very, it has like increased over the years.
Right.
And this has perpetuated the influx of like having children or child domestic workers
Right.
to be inducted in the households because of they are paid less, because of they won't complain, and
Right.
because they can be controlled. So this is basically the trend that we have seen over the years.
Right.
And it is very ironical to see and understand the dichotomy of this poverty and living below the poverty line, whether they are living in the urban scenarios or whether they are living in
the rural areas. And also, it's very pertinent to mention in this regard, then it's intergenerational poverty, because a lot of times
Absolutely,
we see that, you know, their families, their respective parents, they are also working, and then that is a trend that carries on to their respective children. Sir, I would want you to add to this. When we do talk about the overall causes, I think this is something on which Madam very rightly so explained and of course, you know, detailed us upon. But when we talk about this from an educationist viewpoint, sir, how do you feel this lack of quality education, how do you feel this lack of access education, both to the child as well as perhaps to the parent as well, then add to this problem? Because a lot of times we see children are pushed into child labor, either because they do not have access to child, you know, to education, or for that matter, even in the event that they do have access, it is not quality education, so to speak. So how would you correlate education with child labor?
Thank you, Fatma,
You're most welcome,
for
sir.
having me here. I think when we talk about the domestic child labor or the child labor in general, it is probably not as much poverty as much is the cultural acceptance of the fact. What we see here is intergenerational child labor force which is working. The persons who are hiring, they take it as their right to hire
Right.
them. The parents who are giving their children away, they think they are doing a very good service to their children. Unfortunately, the child is the loser there. He or she loses their childhood, they lose their education, they lose their health, and they enter into a situation whereby they are neglected, emotionally traumatized, physically abused, sexually abused.
Right. Psychologically abused too, sir.
Psychologically, yes. And then their potential for education is compromised just because it is not a matter of the education not being available. It is just that they are being deprived
Right.
because of the benefit of others.
Right. So basically, they are being forced to go to people's households and work otherwise rather than going to schools. Sir, in this regard, I would want you to particularly deliberate on this with regards to, of course, the health perspective, since you are a healthcare professional yourself. So when we do talk about analyzing the most adverse trauma-related health outcomes on children, that too, especially when they are subjected to child labor or exploitative practices of the same at a very young age, how would you explain those to be? How do you feel does getting exposed to such exploitation, that too at a very young age, actually lead to childhood trauma, which then transcends during their lifetime?
I mean, there are certain things which are visible. Shazia case was visible. Rizwana case was visible. Children being beaten up are visible. What is not probably visible is the malnutrition that they go, the infections that they get, the problems, the physical issues that they have. What is not visible is the psychological trauma that they are going
Right.
through. Also, the element of neglect. When a child sees a same age child being pampered, sleeping in the mother's lap, while he or she is lying on a floor, and then they go to the school, this child doesn't. They actually this starts a hate relationship with the society,
Right.
not just that family. But these children, they have severe behavioral disturbances, they have severe psychological disturbances, which are not addressed. And once they are not addressed, they live through this trauma throughout their childhood, and they get heart diseases and the other brain disorders, even cancers.
Right,
and
I
other,
was about to
they
just say that.
That's these where we are talking about adverse childhood experiences, and they are related to the experiences that they've had in childhood, which were not addressed.
Right, sir. Coming towards you, Ali, I would want you to add to this, but more so from your viewpoint of being a lawyer yourself. So overall, when we do talk about not one, rather quite a few legal protections that child laborers do have in the Pakistani society. In this regard, it's very important to then mention Article 11 of the Pakistani Constitution, which very categorically actually prohibits child labor under the age of 14, that too with regards to having child labor in factory, mines and hazardous occupations. Moreover, we also understand the fact that when it comes to our provincial laws, we do have a legislative framework in place which gives, child laborers protections more than one. But when it comes to actually practically implementing all these laws and policies on ground, why then is the enforcement so weak?
So, Fatma, as you're aware, Pakistan is relatively a young nation, and significant population of our country is considered as youth. And within that segment, children are the vulnerable segment of our population. And in regards to the overall framework of prohibition of employment of children, Pakistan has actually come a long way. Apart from our international obligations, within our national legislation, we see that a lot of efforts have been put into this issue. Now, we see that the more formal sectors, within the more formal sectors, like industries or commercial establishments, this issue of child labor has somewhat been addressed. But when we talk about the informal sector like domestic workers, this issue actually got momentum within the last 10 years, and we see that the domestic worker legislation then
We have seen
was
the Punjab
introduced
law being passed in this regard, and
Yes.
Sindh has also promulgated a law in this
Yes, in
regard.
2019,
Right.
the domestic workers legislation was passed, and that domestic workers legislation, within that law, it was specifically stated that children under the age of 14 are prohibited from working
Right.
within a household.
Right. And under the Punjab law, it's very important to also mention the fact that you have letter of, rather a contract of employment, so to speak, because you need to ensure that, the working conditions, the terms of employment, they are very categorically specified. But then again, Ali, it goes back to the basics. I think as a country, we are over legislated, so to speak. It all goes back to effectively implementing all these laws. On which I'll come to you, Ms. Elia, and I would want you to add to this further. So overall, how would you analyze Pakistan's entertainment industry working so as to raise awareness about this issue of child labor, be it in the form of films, be it in the form of cinema, be it in the form of, for that matter, even Pakistani dramas, so to speak? Because we have seen in the past that, we have had films touching upon the issue of honor killing, and that in itself has actually led to a very positive change in the law. So in this regard, would you be able to draw that analogy when it comes to the issue of child domestic labor or child labor, so to speak? How would you view this issue?
I think the entertainment industry can certainly play a significant role when it comes to raising awareness about what child labor is, and more importantly, how individuals can take action when they see it happening around them, at homes, at workplaces, and on the streets. So if, for example, a drama or movie shows a character that saves a child from labor and exploitation, and if the story is told effectively in a manner that that stays with the audience, then it may inspire people to do the same, or at least educate them on the various ways in which they can intervene in a situation where they're seeing a child worker. And I think that a lot of times people know that child labor is something that's unethical and unfair, and they know that it is bad, but they don't know what to do against it when they see it happening around them, because no one wants to get in trouble. So people who, even those who know that this practice is immoral and unethical, don't really know how they can intervene. So if this is something, if the intervention part is addressed in dramas and movies, then that is something that can help address this issue of child labor by encouraging people to not stay silent and take action whenever they see a child being forced to work.
Right, Elia, your point is noted. Media definitely has that power to build that momentum for public advocacy, on which I'll come to you, Ms. Umailena, and I would want you to add to this further. So overall, we do see Pakistani dramas catering to issues more than one, be it that of women harassment, be it that of, child abuse, not child labor, or be it that of, for example, projecting women, more particularly diverse women, in a more strong and empowering light. But when it comes to this particular issue of child domestic labor, why then do we not see Pakistani dramas giving due consideration to this issue?
So I totally agree with Elia that media can play an important role in creating awareness and orientation regarding this issue of child domestic labor. But so far what we have seen is that the electronic media and the print media, they have raised this issue over the years, which led to the first inclusion of the domestic workers regarding legislation in Punjab, labor policy in 2015. That was one of the things. And there were like changes in the terminologies also. And then we saw that in 2019, this legislation was enacted, approved and enacted. And now the other provinces are following. So the reason is that this social issue is not very apt for rating in the commercial media.
But we generally do see by that virtue productions and dramas giving due screen space to issues which perhaps might not be that commercially viable. But then moving on, when we do talk about this from another angle, I think another angle on which we must shed light today is that basically parents sending their children to brick kilns. In this regard, we have seen in the past that, not one, rather quite a few raids have taken place. We've also seen that FIRs have been registered against owners, but it then goes back to educating and engaging the parents. How particularly do you feel can that be done? Because if parents are educated, then they won't be sending off their children to brick kilns to start off with.
So I think it's not just the parents, it's the overall society that needs education and orientation on the social issues, or the unethical practices within our societies that we see around everywhere. So this is a very, very important issue where the parents of such families, knowing the repercussions that we have already discussed initially, if they are sending their children, whether they are in the bricklayer sector, whether they are in the domestic work, they should be aware of the repercussions their children are going to face when they are being hired by the employers, and they are mistreated and they are malnourished there, and they face kinds of discrimination and exploitation. And the sense of security that the child loses, and the sense of like in separation from the family is the trauma that Dr. Saab was mentioning, it carries on.
Right.
So I think this kind of thing, the mothers within the families of that child who are sending their children for employment, they should understand this, and they should like take stand among their family that they would not send a child who less than like 18 years.
Right. So the focus then goes back to the media at the end of the day, because you can't possibly send the parents back to school so as to educate them. Sir, to which you wanted to add something?
Yes, I think when we produce these dramas and these things, they touch the hearts of the audience.
Right.
When a woman gets divorced or there's a problem, a domestic problem, it is everybody's problem. When it's a child on the street or a child in labor, it's not my problem.
Right.
It's somebody else's problem. Why should I be bothered?
Which is
That's the
exactly
reason.
why I raised this question, that you see, we
Exactly.
do see dramas giving consideration to so many other social issues. But when we do talk about this from the viewpoint of catering to this issue by perhaps having more viable and well catered to social welfare programs, in this regard, we do understand that the Benazir Income Support Program, that is a very popular program of the government, which provides financial assistance to low income families on conditionally educating their children, at least to the extent of ensuring the school attendance. How do you propose can we have more of such programs which at one end not only do away with poverty, address the issue of poverty, but at the same time they equally work towards preventing child labor, more particularly child domestic labor?
We can't just dole out money and remove a centuries old problem. We have to change the mindset of the people, we have to change the cultural beliefs. So it doesn't come through one program or the other. Yes, they are helpful to a small extent, but more importantly, we need to develop a culture whereby we understand the importance of education in child, we understand the importance of nurturing the child, we understand the importance of this child being able to be a productive citizen in the later life because of the investment that we do on him today.
Right. That's very right, sir. But in addition to that, do you not feel that, if you're looking out for the financial needs of a family, then perhaps that will better motivate them to send their children to schools? Because if they know that, yes, money will be coming in, and this is also the purpose of one of the other programs of the government, Sevre Taaleem program, which actually does offer conditional cash transfers to girl students enrolled in public sector schools in 16 districts with low literacy rate. So at the end of the day, I do understand that this is of course an issue which needs to be looked at more holistically, but initiatives like these, they are perhaps pushing us in that right direction. Alisa, coming towards you, when we do talk about the laws, more particularly the provincial laws of Sindh and of course Punjab, we do understand that yes, registration of home-based workers, of domestic workers, so to speak, has been particularly emphasized upon. But do you feel that, merely registering these workers, that in itself is enough? What more can be done to generally improve enforcement of these laws?
So Fatma, laws and administrative measures, they are just one of the tools through which we address any malice. I think we have talked about the role of media, and in tandem we do see that sometimes on social media certain imagery comes which is abominable in the nature, that in a restaurant there is a family which has a domestic which has a child labor, and they are enjoying the dinner or lunch, whereas that domestic worker, child domestic worker, he or she is being deprived of the food or the same, or even they are unable to share the same table with the child domestic worker.
Right.
Now we see that because there is a cultural and social tolerance towards it, I think the implementation crisis that we see is also closely linked with that. Now, criminalization of one thing is of course going to help address it to a point, but there have to be several measures, and media is one of the ways. Education and awareness is another method through which it can be highlighted. And third, once we have a law, then we have to make precedents to create a deterrence, and we need to further address this issue
Right.
in
We
a
need to
way
strengthen
that
the law. But in this regard, we must also mention this very important and pertinent bill which is being proposed by the NCRC, that is the National Commission on the Rights of Child, which actually looks into these legal lacunas. This offence of keeping children under the age of 18, that should be non-compoundable, that should be non-bailable and also cognizable itself. So that is
Absolutely.
definitely a very big improvement in our laws that way.
Absolutely. So domestic worker, we have the legislation that we have right now. That domestic worker legislation provides a framework for registration and formalizing a relationship between a domestic worker and an employer. But we do not have any law that strictly prohibits working in a domestic environment with penal consequences.
Right.
So a punitive law was long awaited, and we do see that this
Right,
bill
and we
which
do
is
hope
being
that this law
proposed
gets passed.
is going
Right.
to address that issue.
Right. Elia, I'll come to you and I would want you to add to this further. So when we do talk about this from the viewpoint of social media, that too social media, working so as to create perhaps maximum awareness about child rights and the plight of child laborers in the Pakistani society, how effectively do you as a journalist feel that, social media has been able to do just that? Yes, we do understand the fact whenever various cases of exploitation, of maltreatment, of abuse, they are reported, social media does create that hype, it does bring those cases at the forefront. But the question then is that, is this a long-term and a sustainable effort? Does it have that impact of actually educating and sensitizing masses so as to be able to raise their voices against such crimes, that too, consistently?
Social media is definitely an important tool which, if used smartly, can result in real change. And there are several new features now that are very popular, that are a very effective way to reach the audience, like short videos and reels. And I think, since I have limited time, I don't think I have the time to name every social media feature that can be used for this purpose. But one thing that I want to mention is the importance of countering misinformation and justifications that are given for child labor. For example, a lot of times people who employ children at their homes say that they're doing these children a favor by providing them with food and shelter, and that if they don't employ them, then somebody who is abusive might. I think nothing could be more ignorant than this argument. The fact that you're making a child work means that you're stealing their childhood regardless of how nice you are to them. So I think such concepts need to be debunked and challenged through social media campaigns, for which the government can be, bring social media influencers on board, so that the message against such pro-child labor arguments gets a wider audience. I also think that a lot of times the social media campaigns that are designed for this purpose are not, they lack creativity, and they're designed by people who are not very well versed in social media. So I think it is also important to note that the government needs to collaborate with people who know how social media works, how algorithm work, how people who have a significant following on social media, they need to be brought on board for this purpose. That way, such social media campaigns can be effective.
Because in this regard, then of course we do need to ensure that social media not only educates people about this very issue, but in the course of doing that also proposes solutions to issues which are then at a very basic level linked with child labor. To which, madam, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add to what Elia has just recommended. I think as a responsible citizen and as a society, we need to develop a mechanism of monitoring monitoring the increasing child domestic labor within our own societies, within our own communities. So there should be a whistleblowing mechanism where the societies can play a very important role, and then the monitoring of the within the vicinity where the houses are they are inducting the child labor. So we can start a campaign, awareness campaign, and we can there's a campaign running in Islamabad that this house does not have a child labor. So I think these kinds of things should come up from the society, from our children, that they should raise awareness, and this would provide I think a very
this
productive.
would also provide the deterrence element, so to speak, and it would perhaps lead towards better compliance with the laws too.
Absolutely.
But when we talk about this from the viewpoint of various industries, for example, Pakistan's fashion industry, what responsibility do you then feel lies on industries like these when it comes to being transparent about their business practices, when it comes to being transparent with regards to the people, more particularly the children, underage children that they do hire? Because internationally we have seen that this is an issue of growing concern when brands, more particularly fashion brands, they end up hiring underage children. They have received backlash in this regard too.
You see, this is a very exploitative practice over the years, which we have been observing within the supply chains of the fashion industry. So there is an influx of the informal workers, and with this influx of informal workers at the third tier, whether they are like children working in that supply chain, whether they are girls working in that supply chains, they are not part of that workforce, and the brands and the fashion industries, they are not able to have any data or any evidence to prove that this exists within their supply chain. But at the third tier or the second tier, when it comes to the suppliers, we see that the child laboring is increasing in countries like Pakistan and in countries like developing countries, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. The reason is again the poverty and no infrastructure available to come forward to protect those families who are under debt.
But when it comes to catering this issue with reference to the fashion industry, do you not feel here that a responsibility also lies on us to be more responsible perhaps in this regard, so as to make more sustainable choices with regards to our purchases as well? If we know that a brand is engaging children and making them work, perhaps choose to part ways with them as well. Sir, I would want you to add to this. When we do talk about this, again from the health perspective, because I do understand that that is your domain, so to speak, and when we do talk about the not one, rather quite a few negative health outcomes which child laborers might suffer from, what role do you feel can not only mental healthcare professionals but pediatricians like yourself, even for that matter educators, play when it comes to reintegrating and rehabilitating these children back in the society? Because the focus should then ideally just not be curbing the abuse and of course ending the exploitation. It should also go a step further so as to rehabilitate these children back into the society too.
I think first we must understand every work is not child labor. Because when we are talking about the health perspectives and others, we have to differentiate between child work and child labor. Whenever there is exploitation of a child, when there is a problem with his or her health, dignity or moral values, and health also means the psychological health, then it is child labor. When a child is helping their parents or their family in earning, when they are working alongside their parents in a shop, or a plumber comes to my house and he carries his 13, 14-year-old child, then it is child work, because that child is not exploited. He is studying and he is playing, he has his childhood with him.
Right.
So these are the children whom we should, and they are actually learning. They are working as an apprentice. These are the ones that need to be encouraged. Whereas the work, wherever there is an exploitation, that has to be curbed. Now, how to prevent it? Now, the important thing is, again, I have always maintained it has to be the mindset. We have to, the demand side and the supply side, both have to we have to work on both sides.
Right. And so when we talk about prevention, then of course the role of all the stakeholders, be it the government, be it the civil society, be it the education institutions, even the parents, so to speak, that needs to be very cohesive and very coordinated at the end of the day, because a lot of times we also see from the society, at least, even if children are pulled out from this social menace of child domestic labor, child labor, so to speak, when they do want to make that effort to reintegrate back, there's a lot of stigma surrounding this. On which I'll come to you, Ms. Alia, and I would want you to add to this further. So overall, when we do talk about reporting on such sensitive issues, more particularly on that of child domestic labor or the violence that of course children might undergo in the course of such employment, how particularly do you feel should media do just that? Because a lot of times we do understand the fact that yes, media has to report on such incidents, and it's very important that it actually does so because it is raising awareness on the plight of child laborers. But how particularly do you then propose should this be done in a more sensitive and of course in a more humane and ethical manner?
That's a very important question, one that is often ignored. Unfortunately, in Pakistani newsrooms, we don't have formal training for reporters who cover stories related to children. And that, I think, is something that is the reason why we don't have enough stories that follow ethical principles. First and foremost, as a reporter, you should make every effort to protect the privacy and dignity of the child that you're reporting on. When you're covering a child labor related story or any story related to a child, the spotlight should be on the person or organization involved in child labor, not on the victim. Secondly, it is important to approach children with the sensitivity they deserve. Don't ask questions that might scare them, and try to reassure them that you have their best interests in mind. Try to ask yourself whether the report or the documentary or whatever you're going to produce as part of your reporting, will it help raise awareness or will it just create trouble for the victims? And once you have your answer, then act accordingly. It's not a big deal if you have to drop the story. If you think that this would create trouble, just don't do it and find another way to help that child. Also, always ensure that stories involving children are edited not just by a regular editor, but by someone trained in ethical journalism. This is also important, and it's not something that our newsrooms follow. Being ethical in journalism is always important. So I think that there needs to be more discussion on how newsrooms can develop a system where stories on children are vetted more carefully. And, ethical journalism is always important, but it is even more crucial when you're working on a story involving children.
On which I'll come to you, Alisa, and I would want you to add to this further. Overall, when we do talk about the need for there to be perhaps more sensitive reporting of such child right abuses, do you not feel here that we generally do need to aspire towards, having more effective legal enforcement, law enforcement, so to speak? And then, of course, in this regard, something that we cannot ignore is also the special needs of marginalized children, be it, children who are differently able, be it children who might be refugees, or for that matter, even who might belong from the religious minority, so to speak. Do you not feel that here we need perhaps special laws and policies to protect such children from exploitative practices too?
To specifically reply to your question, we see that within the child domestic worker categories, then we have to further bifurcate them even.
Right.
There is a distinction of gender. So in all likelihood, a female child is even more vulnerable within this category of workers. And then even the ethnicity of the worker or the faith of the worker does come into play as to how the employer is dealing with that particular child.
And also then, Ali, the issue of child marriage, so to speak, because you see that is also a very burning issue at the end of the day. A lot of times we see that children who are forced into wedlocks, they might be more vulnerable to child domestic labor per se too.
Yes, child marriage is again then sometimes we have seen these incidents where child marriages have taken place within this arrangement where exploitation of that child is has taken place. So these legislative provisioning provides us a context in which the implementation has to take place. But at the end of the day, the recognition of this fact that the child domestic labor is a big issue, and the state's capacity to enforce it in every household where this is going to take place is not going to be enough.
And then we would need to focus on the importance of having the requisite public-private partnerships too.
Absolutely.
Madam, I'll come to you, and moving towards the end of the show, my last question to you would be that, overall, if you are to then evaluate, what are the most notable government initiatives you see which are then working to do away with this social menace? Yes, we do understand that the government is committed so as to do away with this issue, but then again, you see this has to happen at a very basic level. We have to address this issue by nipping the root causes, so to speak. We do see that, the NCRC bill, something that we earlier talked about, that is a very progressive step. And then, of course, we have seen that over time, basically, not one, rather quite a few provincial laws have been passed too. But when it comes to having long-term systemic reform, what are the issues you feel that we as a Pakistani society need to work upon so as to do away with such exploitative practices?
So I think with regard to the laws and legislation, Pakistan is doing very good, and we have recognized, and we have now legislations for the protection of the informal workers, which you already pointed out, home-based workers and the domestic workers, and this new law, the child domestic labor, is coming up. So these are all very effective legislations that we see. But the issue that I see is over the period of time that I have been working in the development sector, the implementation of these laws, they are not up to the mark, and that is where we lack as a society. So I think we need to put all our impetus on the implementation of all these very valuable laws, and not all just on the implementation of the laws, but creating awareness among the masses about the consequences that child domestic labor or domestic workers.
And then, if I may add, I think the importance of international cooperation and involving international partners in this regard too, that is something that we cannot ignore. We need to have them on board so as to not only advocate, but also to make our collaborations and our work more effective that way, on which I'll come to you, sir, and before we conclude today's show. So overall, when we do talk about concluding today's discussion, what do you feel would be the dangers of not, getting rid of this social menace of child labor and child domestic labor and leaving it completely unchecked? Because we do appreciate the fact that this is something which just doesn't affect children, it also impacts families, communities, and the society at large. Why is it so important that today onwards we pledge to fight against it, not only in terms of perhaps improving our law enforcement, but also having greater mass awareness campaigns in this regard too?
I think it has to be taken into three different dimensions. The social dimension, the economic dimension, and the health dimension. Talking about the social dimension, we know that this will lead to further putting those children into the cycle of poverty, into the cycle of uneducatedness, and into the most vulnerable position of abuse and neglect. Economically, obviously, when these children do not get education, they do not get skills, they do not progress, and they ultimately they go down the scale of the poverty line, and overall the community then suffers for it. Now, the most important thing, which health, we understand that these children are going to be scarred for life, and through our knowledge, we know that once these children are they have suffered in their childhood, these things go along with the whole life cycle, providing them with less opportunities to help themselves in education, and help themselves in let's say even in their health. So they have psychological problems, relationship problems with their wives, relationship problems with their families, and then also their suicidality is more, they are more prone to drugs, and then ultimately what they do the whole society suffers with them.
Of course. Which is why, again, I think this goes back to the basics that when it comes to proposing solutions, we need to have a more holistic approach to it. Right, sir. Coming towards you, Ali Saab, and my last question to you would then be that overall, when we do talk about this issue vis-a-vis, the issue of climate change, vis-a-vis the issue of climate-induced migration, we must then, of course, talk about the need for there to be perhaps more effective policies to address such concerns too. A lot of times we see that, when people migrate because of climate change, or their children particularly, they might be more vulnerable to child domestic labor or child labor per se. How particularly do you then propose can be then cater to this issue by having perhaps more holistic policies, so to speak? Do you feel that this is an issue which has already been prioritized in our current legislative framework, or do you feel that this is an issue that we do need to actively work upon in the future?
So, Fatma, as the proverb goes, it takes a village to raise a child. And when we see that there is a rural-urban migration taking place for host of reasons. Now, this displacement of any sort or conflicts taking place which causes families to move from their hometowns for better, greener pastures, or any disaster that may cause such displacement or migration, we see that then it becomes a bigger issue. Now that bigger issue then transforms into aggravating and further compounding this problem of child labor, where children invariably suffers. Now the urban centers are where this we see that historically speaking the child domestic workers are most exploited, or where there is a supply demand relationship for this particular category of workers. Now those entry points are where the enforcements or where interventions are required foremost. Now that would depend on a peculiar situation where this issue is taking place.
Right, and this again, of course, by virtue of that would entail having the right statistics and of course data in place so as to be able to have perhaps more informed policies. Right, so your point is noted. On which I'll come to you, Alien, before we conclude today's show. So my last question to you would be in light of the SDGs related to children, SDG 4 which talks about quality education, and then SDG 8 which talks about decent work and economic growth, how important is it then for Pakistani media not only to positively highlight all the positive social developments that we do see happening in the area of child labor, in the areas of child rights, so to speak, but at the same time to give equal consideration to issues which need to be worked upon, which need to be reformed? And why is it so important that it does so in a manner which is then very cognizant of the fact that this is done in a way which then projects us as a Pakistani nation in a more stronger and of course in a more progressive light?
I think the media should just report what is the truth and not just look for or highlight positive stories. I don't think that media should be pressured to find positive stories. If they are not able to find positive stories, then they should just show what the facts are. So I don't think that the media should be expected to or asked to highlight positive stories in particular. I think the media's job is to act as a watchdog. I think media's primary responsibility is to facilitate accountability. And accountability is something that media needs to focus on. And definitely international image is important, but I do think that we do have success stories as well. But at the same time, I think media should just stick to its role of reporting the facts as they are. So I think the media, while it is important for the media to highlight the importance of achieving these goals, I don't think that media should just show the positive sides of it and ignore the areas in which progress has not been made.
On which note I would like to conclude today's show. Thank you so much, madam. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, Ali Saab, and thank you so much, Ms. Elia, for your time today. Well, to conclude today's show, we generally spoke about the burning social issue of child labor and child domestic labor as it does stand in the Pakistani society today. In this regard, we not only shed light on its peculiar causes, but also, of course, the way it impacts children, families, and communities at large. It goes without saying that, Pakistani constitution, Pakistani laws do provide adequate legal protections to children person. In this regard, we also see that a new bill is being brought forward by the NCRC. But the question then again, of course, remains is that we need to, at a very basic level, ensure its effective implementation. And for this, definitely, we do need to not only change our societal attitudes, we also definitely need to foster collective action from different stakeholders. We need to perhaps, aspire of combining legal services with social support services, be it that of education, be it that of social welfare, be it that of, even for that matter, perhaps improved healthcare provision. In this regard, of course, it goes without saying that the Pakistani media has a very important responsibility vested on it too. We need to ensure that, all child right related issues, child labor related issues, they are then reported not only in an impactful manner, but in a manner which is then, of course, very cognizant of the dignity of any child too. Thank you for watching The Society. Until next time, take care and Allah Hafiz.